You know, people, how we use history is actually in many ways just as much a field of the study of history as a direct study of events or things from the past. And history can be used in politics, in philosophy, and in many other fields. And one field that is often very overlooked is the use of history in media and fiction, which I am going to describe in this video. The use of history in media and fiction can be roughly divided into the following types of usage. First is direct use of history, which is a description of an historical event and or person or thing. For example, you take events that have happened and retell them in a fictionalized format, usually with only minor changes to the events or persons involved. Sometimes these changes are due to practical concerns in making the media or due to interpretations of history that might differ from other interpretations of what happened. So changes in this sort of use of history aren't always a case of deliberate changes due to stylistical reasons or reasons to make the media much more interesting. Though this last reason is usually the case why certain choices are made with regards to this type of use of history. Some examples of this use of history includes the movie Downfall, about the last days in the life of Adolf Hitler, and Colin McCullough's Masters of Rome series that mostly focus upon the life of Julius Caesar. Even if it is somewhat fictionalized, it is very accurate to Roman life and the happenings that happened around Caesar in many regards. Very close to this use of history, this direct use of history, but where the media in question is also kind of argumentative for a certain view of history that goes against most mainstream interpretations of history, is revisionist use of history in media, where events and persons are portrayed in a very different way from what they are usually done in history. Now, this use of history does not necessarily have to be wrong, but can be highly inaccurate sometimes, or just be a legitimate other view, and thus can be sometimes hard to separate from just normal direct use of history. An example of revisionist history used in media is media connected to the lost cause, to the arguments for the Southern Confederacy in the American Civil War. For example, Gods and Generals, which is a movie that focuses upon the cause of the Civil War being a question about state rights rather than slavery, as most historians would argue that it was about. Going from the use of revisionist history in the media, we now go into the use of history in media as propaganda, where certain types of history are chosen in order to support various political causes. For example, history that portrays one sort of politics as bad or as good are chosen. These things, of course, also interact with revisionist history and more ordinary use of direct history, because what you choose to show from history is, after all, a choice, and these choices can have political ramifications. Due to the sensitive nature of this topic, I'm not going to bring forth an example of what I consider to be a historical propagandist movie. Next, we have the use of history as a period setting, where a story or fiction takes place during a historical period, but does not have to be about an actual historical event or person, but generally about some fictional people that lived during this period of history. For example, the game LA Noire, which takes place in the late 40s Los Angeles, but uses fictional characters and fictional crimes to be solved. The use of history as a period setting is very common in fiction and can be seen in many dramas, and can also be used as a way to depict things that would, in a more modern context, be considered inappropriate or too controversial to show, or would just not work as our society is too different from what is required to exist in the setting in order for these stories to be told. History here works as kind of a setting for another world where the rules of society are different, and thus give greater flexibility in writing in certain ways, though it also limits the writer's flexibility in that these historical settings have their own rules about what is inappropriate or not, and what can happen or not happen. And if these rules are not followed, you risk causing anachronism, which is where something that belongs in another historical period is inserted in an historical period where it does not belong. And this can be quite jarring. Or sometimes it might even be intentional, as the media in question could be aiming at alternative history, which is counterfactual history that didn't happen, or things in the story happened differently from what happened in reality, intentionally so, as kind of an alternative scenario of history being used as the background for a story. For example, the Germans winning World War II, with, for example, the man in the high castle as an example. Nazis winning and taking over the world seems to be pretty popular in fiction. Though other examples of alternative history fiction does also exist, with more or less likely scenarios to actually have been possible in the past. Alternative history could here be also argued to be a sort of meta-discussion on history, which also leads to another use of history. And that is media that is discussing history and the use of history as a meta-discussion. That is to say, what is history? And how does history affect people within it? And what is the importance of history and learning from it? Or in justifying things based upon historical precedents, or what happened before. A series that I think does this exceedingly well, and that I will discuss in a future video on this channel, is the Killzone franchise. That, despite being set in the future, poses very deep questions about history and its relevance for various conflicts. Killzone as a franchise is also an excellent example of another type of use of history, and that is the use of references to history in the media. Like, for example, making enemies seem like Nazis, like the Helghast in Killzone, or the infamous stormtroopers of the Empire in Star Wars. And when Nazis are not used, it is not unusual that you make references to the Roman Empire in order to present someone or a fictional culture or civilization as civilized. Or when you want to present someone as being uncivilized, barbaric or wild, you make references to people that have historically been viewed as barbarians, such as the Mongols, the Huns, various Germanic tribes, or the Vikings. References can also be very small things, like giving historically important names to certain characters in order to indicate some trait, or similarity to that historical person who bore that name. You could also have a fictional event imitating historical events as a nod to these historical events, or in order to give commentary upon them for some sort of social purpose. Or you could just use history as a source of inspiration. Creativity is, after all, not limitless, regardless of what some people would claim, and usually it is a lot easier to just copy what has happened or existed before than to create something entirely new from scratch. Also, it is much easier to make it understandable if you copy things from history, as the audience is probably expected to at least have some prior historical understanding that will ease the audience of the media into this new narrative or fictional world, if there is at least some sort of similarity to our world within it, coming from history. Actually, on the subject of understandability, most use of history is supposed to be easily understandable by the audience, as financial incentives exist in order to make it so, as you want to make it so that people enjoy the media and thus consume it and thus spend money on it, usually. And in many types of media you are also constrained by how much of history you can show, so you have to choose which history to show. And references to history or use of certain set pieces or other types of use of history must be popular enough for an audience to understand it quickly within these limited time frames or amounts of texts that you have And this will be largely dependent upon the cultural context of what history is valued and thought about to be valued in that society. Different cultural contexts and their audiences will have different histories and have different focuses upon what is considered important history and which type of views you should have on history. For example, the use of history in media aimed at a Middle Eastern audience will probably be rather different from the history presented in media aimed at a Western audience. For example, references to Harun Rashid, the famous Abbasid Caliph, as a standard literary figure, or why the Umayyad Caliph Yazid I is depicted as the devil by Shia Muslims, will probably go over the head of most Western audiences that are not familiar with the history behind these figures. And it's also an example how learning history can help you with understanding culture as well. And with that said, this is the end of the video. If you have any comments or questions, please post them and I will try to respond as quickly as possible. Also, please post an example of the use of history in media that you yourself have encountered. I would love to hear your examples about this. Please do subscribe as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.